These invitations were highly honourable to me, but it was complete servitude and made me as much a prisoner as the prince, with the additional weight of responsibility. The strict obligation of always accompanying the prince in my uniform interfered with many amusements. In going to the theatres he was instantly recognized and rudely stared at, and even had we risked going in plain clothes, contrary to our instructions, there still remained an obstacle. The prince wore mustachios, by which he would be immediately known, and with these he was very unwilling to part. I told him that if he shaved them off, I should run all hazard and accompany him in plain clothes in some of our nocturnal rambles. After urgent expostulations on my part and profound sighs on his, he consented to have them removed. He sat down before a mirror, determined, despite of cavalry pride, to cut down the long, cherished bristly curls of war. His hand trembled. He shrank from the first touch of the razor, yet he bore the amputation of the right wing with tolerable fortitude. Then, turning to me with a deep sigh, he held up the amputated member clotted with lethal soap. He looked mournful and pale, but however I may have commiserated his grief, for the life of me I could not refrain from laughing aloud at the appearance of his face with one mustachio only, which, deprived of its old companion, appeared double its former length. I requested him to give the hanger-on no quarter, but instantly to cut him down. The operation soon followed. The mustachios were washed, cleaned, and dried, then carefully wrapped up in silver paper and forwarded with a pathetic letter to the Duchess, his wife. The prince declared that he never again would act the soldier either for Napoleon or any other. This determination arose entirely from his being tired of the army, not from cutting off the mustachios, which act bore no analogy to the story of Delilah. And although I was instrumental in cutting off the hairs of war, if not of strength, he never found in me a Philistine. A tailor was now sent for to make him a brown-coated gentleman. We now felt no obstacle to our enjoyment of many amusements from which we previously were debarred, for such was the metamorphosis from the splendid cavalry uniform, highly decorated breast, blackened and curled whiskers and mustachios, and the fierce tout ensemble to the simple brown coat and the plain civic face, that had I not been present at the barbarous deed, I scarcely could have believed him to be the same person. And such was my reliance on his word that I felt no hesitation about his going out, even alone. The prince entertained very liberally whilst in Lisbon. When he was not dining out, there were 12 covers at his table for the officers, his fellow prisoners, who were invited in rotation. One officer alone, a lieutenant of artillery, was never invited. It was alleged that when we attacked on the morning of the action, this unfortunate young man, who commanded the artillery, had no matches lit, and that had he been prepared, we must have lost more men in killed and wounded while filing through the town. In consequence, he was cut by every French officer in Lisbon. I felt much for him, and mentioned to the prince that where they were all alike unfortunate, it appeared invidious to single out one for neglect. For whatever his fault might have been, it could not have had the slightest effect in changing the result of the action. The prince, although a stern soldier, somewhat relented, but there was such a person as Napoleon to be taken into consideration. However, he mentioned the circumstance to General Lebrun, expressing an inclination to become reconciled to the artillery officer. Lebrun would not listen to it, alleging that it would be setting a dangerous example to look over or in any way countenance gross neglect of duty, at the same time casting a scowling look at me, knowing that it was I who spoke to the prince on the subject. Annoyed at his obduracy and a little nettled by his indignant look, I asked him if he did not think that, had there been mounted patrols on the lookout to give alarm in proper time, the artillery officer, thus warned, would have had his guns in battle array, instead of which we came absolutely into the town without encountering a single French dragoon. The general treated my observation with haughty silence, but the French adjutant general, also a prisoner being present, darted a fiery glance at Lebrun and would no doubt have applied his censure of the artillery officer to himself, had he not been restrained out of consideration for the prince, who was second in command of the cavalry. Lebrun was disliked by all from his haughty and overbearing manner. When after the action the officers made prisoners were required to sign their parole, Lebrun refused, saying that the word of a general of the French was sufficient. Our quartermaster general, Colonel Offley, a gallant and determined soldier, a German by birth, soon settled the affair in a summary way by giving orders that if the general refused to sign his parole, he was to be marched with the bulk of the prisoners. This order cooled the general's hauteur. He subscribed. On one occasion, when a large party of French officers dined with us, the prince asked me to what town in England I thought it likely he would be sent as prisoner of war. This I could not possibly answer. He then asked which I considered the second town in England. I said that from a commercial point of view we generally ranked Liverpool next to London, but as places of fashionable resort, Brighton, Bath and Cheltenham ranked much alike. I inadvertently asked him which he considered the second town in France. Rome, said he, ranks the second and Amsterdam the third. I remarked that then we had no longer an Italy or a Holland. Yes, replied the prince, we have both. But by a late edict of the emperor, those two towns are annexed to France, but it is not the policy of England to recognize it. I made a low bow. In compliment to me, I suppose, the prince changed the topic immediately, saying that he dreaded a ship so much that he would sooner fight the battles of Talavera and Albuera over again than undertake so long a voyage as that to England. I told him to quiet himself on that head, for he might get to England in 2 hours. The whole company stared, but particularly Lebrun, who was always a standing dish at the prince's table. Speculation ran high. A balloon was generally suggested, but the velocity even of this was doubted. I denied the agency of a balloon, and maintained that it was to be accomplished by wind and water solely. As I still withheld an explanation, the prince got off his chair, and flinging away his little foraging cap said, "If you do not tell us, I shall give you a kiss, and I know that you would sooner get a slap on the face than be kissed by a man." On his advancing towards me, I requested that he would sit down and I would give him an explanation which I felt persuaded would convince all present that my assertion was perfectly correct. At this, a general laugh followed. The prince being reseated, I addressed him thus. "In less than 2 hours after you leave the quay, you will have got rid of all the boats which impede your passage down the Tagus, and immediately after you will steer clear of Fort St. Julian at the influx of the river. You are then at sea and arrived, for by an old edict recognized by every sovereign in Europe, all the seas are England." The whole company endeavoured, although awkwardly, to force a laugh, except Lebrun, whose scowling frown indicated his chagrin, and I fancied that I distinguished the word bêtise muttered between his teeth. I longed for an opportunity of paying him off. It soon occurred. Lebrun called next morning, as usual, big with nothing. Perceiving that he wished to be alone with the prince, I retired to the next room. Soon after, the prince requested me to come back. He was much excited, and flinging his cap on the floor. "Only think," said he, "what the general has been telling me as an undoubted fact. Some rascally Portuguese has persuaded him to believe that above 100 sail of French line of battleships have appeared before Cadiz, that the British squadron, stationed there, were compelled to fly, that the fortress must immediately surrender, and consequently all Spain must soon be in our possession. In the first place," added the prince, "all the navy of France do not amount to the number which the general says are before Cadiz. without taking into consideration the utter impossibility of their being enabled to form such a junction unmolested in the face of the British Navy. If a corporal of my regiment told me such a story, believing it, I should turn him into the ranks. At this remark, the general became highly indignant, and the prince's excitement much increased. To restore tranquillity, I asked the general about the appearance of the person who gave him the important information, and nodding assent to his description, I exclaimed, "The very man who spoke to me this morning." "There," said the general, happy to have anything like corroboration. "And what did he tell you?" I looked round with much apparent precaution, and after anxious pressing on his part, and affected hesitation on mine, I got quite close to the prince and the general, who took a chair. I then, in a low tone of voice, our three heads nearly touching, said, "When I came to Lisbon, this same Portuguese was pointed out to me as a person who always possessed much information, but sold it dearly." All this time, the prince was staring at me, knowing that I bore no great affection for the general. "But," said the general, "what information did he give you?" "He told me that he knew to a certainty, from a source which could not be doubted. I think you said 100? "Yes," replied Lebrun. 100 sail of the line. "He told me," I resumed, "that there were 200,000 British troops absolutely on the boulevards of Paris, but not a single soul could tell whence they came. I gave my informant 6 gros sous. How much did you give, mon général?" At this, the prince absolutely became convulsed with laughter. The general darted from his chair, snatched up his hat, and turning his head half round, gave us the most ungracious bonjour that I ever heard escape the lips of a Frenchman, and then strode out of the room. Scarcely had he left when the prince ran forward and absolutely embraced me, saying that I had done him the greatest favour which I could possibly confer, as he felt sure the general would torment him no more. He was right. Lebrun never again called. About this time a very laughable scene took place in Lisbon. An announcement was published in the papers that an English officer would walk across the Tagus with cork boots. At the hour specified the concourse was immense. 20,000 persons at least were collected at Balaam, the place indicated. Every boat on the Tagus and every vehicle in the town, of whatever description, was hired for several days previously. A Portuguese guard were posted to keep the cork boot platform clear, and a military band attended. It was, in fact, a magnificent pageant. At length the hour of execution arrived, but no cork boots. Hour after hour passed, but still the principal actor was wanting. The spectators, wearied by fruitless expectation, began to retire. And here the ingenuity of the hoax was displayed, for when some thousands had moved off, a sudden rush was made towards the platform. Those who retired instantly returned, but only to be disappointed. This ruse, strange to be said, repeatedly succeeded. Back came the crowd, but the great Earl of Cork never came forth. At length, and after dark, all retired in the worst possible temper. Many did not reach their homes until after midnight. Although Belém was not more than 5 miles from Lisbon, such was the throng both on the Tagus and along the roads. Next day, all Lisbon was in uproar at being thus insulted by the English, who denied all knowledge of the affair, and in reply to a remonstrance made by the Portuguese government on the subject to the English authorities, it was asked rather acrimoniously how such an absurd article had been permitted to appear in the public prints when the censorship of the press was entirely in the hands of the Portuguese government. This was rather a poser, and the affair died away in languid laughter. The time having arrived for the prince's departure for England, Captain Percy, in whose ship he was to proceed, mentioned to me that he had some hope of procuring an exchange between the prince and his father, Lord Beverley, who was detained in France. requesting also that I would ascertain from the prince what he wished put on board for his little comforts. The prince, in reply, commissioned me to tell Captain Percy that as to the exchange he felt fully persuaded that Napoleon, although the uncle of his wife the Duchess, would never consent to the exchange, that as to his comforts on board he felt extremely obliged to Captain Percy for his polite and kind attention, and the only thing he requested was a little old rum. I delivered his message, but told him that it was scarcely necessary, for there was always sufficient rum on board a man-of-war. On parting, he told me that whenever I should come to Brussels, I should have no formal invitation to his father's palace. I should live there and invite whom I pleased, for I must consider myself as a master in the house. How I treated him while we lived together as prisoner and guard may be seen in a letter which I had the honour of receiving some years afterwards from His late Royal Highness the Duke of Kent. It was at my option to accompany the Prince to England. I was strongly recommended to do so, and the Prince warmly urged me to the same effect. The bait was tempting, but although better success would undoubtedly have attended a campaign in the luxurious Green Park, surrounded by magnificent mansions, traversed by splendid equipages, studded with groups of noble courtiers and glittering flatterers, yet I preferred the uncompromising discharge of my duty and the wild scenery and extensive plains of Spain in company with my gallant companions of the war, whose hearts were open as the boundless tracts they traversed, their friendship fervid as the genial sun which glowed over their heads, and their sincerity pure and unsullied as the mountain breezes they inhaled. All this was good enough for me. On the departure of the Prince, I immediately joined my regiment at Albuquerque. On my arrival, I had the honour of dining with General Hill. He congratulated me on my good fortune in carrying the Prince safely to Lisbon, remarking that had I not been able to harangue the peasantry in their native language, 60 soldiers instead of 6 would scarcely have been a sufficient guard. The general had heard from several Spanish officers of the difficulty and danger which I had encountered. He then congratulated me on the certainty of my immediate promotion, was pleased to say that I should soon reap the reward which I so well merited, and then handed me the following letter, which he requested me to keep by me. Gallegos, January 16th, 1812. Sir, I am directed to transmit to you the annexed extract of a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Torrens in reply to your recommendation in favour of Lieutenant Blakeney. The Commander-in-Chief will take an early opportunity of recommending Lieutenant Blakeney for promotion. I have the honour to be, etc., Fitzroy Somerset, Military Secretary, Lieutenant General Hill. Towards the latter end of February, my name appeared in the Gazette, promoted to a company in the 36th Regiment, dated January 16th, 1812. After endeavouring in vain to accomplish an exchange back into my old corps, I forwarded a memorial to the Duke of Wellington, applying for permission to join the 1st Battalion, 36th Regiment, then in the Peninsula. His Grace answered that he could not interfere with the appointment of an officer from one battalion to another, that being promoted I must join the 2nd Battalion, to which I properly belonged, and that I must therefore proceed to England and report my arrival to the Adjutant General. A copy of this answer was forwarded from headquarters to the officer commanding the 1st Battalion 36th Regiment, then at Almendralejo. It was matter of surprise to many that whilst hundreds of officers were vainly applying for leave to go to England, I could not procure leave to keep from it. But such, no doubt, were the arrangements between the Horse Guards and the army in the Peninsula. In the beginning of March, General Hill moved upon Merida, endeavouring to surprise a detachment of the enemy there stationed. He approached within a short distance without being discovered, but an advanced guard being at length perceived, the enemy hastily evacuated the town. As we neared the place, we saw their rear guard of cavalry crossing the bridge. Our cavalry and light artillery had previously forded the Guadiana, and it was confidently expected would soon come up with the retiring foe. No longer doing duty with the 28th Regiment, I rode over the bridge as the German dragoons were closely pressing on the enemy's rear, passing by their flank. I soon came in view of their main body. They proceeded hesitatingly, having no doubt been informed by their patrols that our cavalry had already forded the Guadiana. They halted on a conical hill, or rather rising mound, which they occupied from its base to its summit, apparently expecting to be charged. I immediately wheeled round, and returning at full speed informed General Hill of what I had seen. The general, whose coolness was never more apparent than when the full energy of the mind was called into action, replied in his usual placid manner, "Very well, we shall soon be with them. Gallop over the bridge again and tell General Long to keep closer to the wood." Instantly setting off, I soon recrossed the bridge, at the far end of which I met Lord Charles Fitzroy, returning after having delivered a similar message. The cavalry general's reply was that he wished to keep clear of the skirts of the wood, when one of us remarked that the wood must have skirts more extensive than a dragoon's cloak to keep them at such a distance. The enemy, perceiving how far they kept away, descended from the mound on which they had expected to be charged, and rapidly pushed forward without any molestation. For as our dragoons moved, they still more deviated from the enemy's line of march and seemed to be en route for Badajoz. Had our cavalry closed upon the wood and even menaced a charge, the progress of the enemy would have been impeded. But had our cavalry and light guns, by which they were accompanied, pushed forward rapidly, which they could have done since the plain was flat and level, and headed the enemy, they would have kept them until our infantry came up. But nothing of the kind was attempted, and so every French soldier escaped, though every one ought to have been made prisoner, and this affair of Mérida would have been more complete than even that of Arroyo Molinos. For when I reported the position of the enemy to General Hill, they were not more than 2 miles distant from our advanced guard. This affair caused an era in the life of General Hill, for I heard many of his oldest acquaintances remark that before the evening of this day they never saw a cloud upon his brow. All hopes of being permitted to remain in the peninsula having vanished, I resolved to return to England. With heavy heart I parted from the regiment in which I first drew my sword, in which my earliest friendships were formed and my mind modelled as a soldier. In Colonel Abercrombie's quarters at Mérida, many of the officers were assembled. Sorrowful, I bade adieu to my gallant old comrades, and quaffed a goblet to their future success, whilst I clasped the colours to my breast, those colours which alone throughout the British Army proudly display the names of the 2 bloodiest fought battles in the peninsula, Barossa and Albuera, and in each of these battles the regiment claimed a double share of the glory. At Barossa, while Colonel Belson, at the head of the 1st Battalion, charged and turned the chosen grenadiers forming the right of the enemy's line, Colonel Brown of the regiment, at the head of their flank companies, united with those of 2 other corps, commanded the independent flank battalion, and this battalion, the first in the battle and alone, suffered more casualties both in officers and men, I allude particularly to the flankers of the 28th Regiment, than triple that sustained by any other battalion present in that memorable fight. At Albuera, the 2nd Battalion of the regiment were led by a gallant officer, Colonel Patterson, and the brigade in which they served, that which with the brigade of the gallant Fusiliers turned the wavering fortunes of the day, were commanded by the gallant Abercrombie, the 2nd Lieutenant Colonel of the regiment. Next morning at parting, the light bobs gave me a cheer. I distinguished among them some few of the old ventriloquists of Galicia, but on this occasion their notes were, I believe, genuine. I bade a mournful farewell to the old slashers and bent my steps towards Badajoz, then about to be besieged. The next evening, March 15th, I came before the place, and very opportunely Lieutenant Huddleston of the 28th Regiment, my brother officer in the battalion company, which I commanded for a short time, arrived on the same day, being appointed to serve in the engineer department. He willingly shared his tent with me, and Sir Frederick Slavin, also of the 28th Regiment, then Adjutant General of the 3rd Division, introduced me to General Picton, who did me the honour of saying that I should always find a cover at his table during my stay before Badajoz. General Bose, with whom I had the pleasure of being acquainted at Gibraltar, gave me a similar invitation. Thus, finding myself comparatively at home, I felt in no way inclined to proceed too quickly to Lisbon. During the siege, I assisted generally in the trenches. On March 16th, everything was finally arranged, and on the following evening, the different divisions and regiments prepared to occupy their respective posts. All the troops being assembled, generals and commanding officers inspected their brigades and regiments in review order. The parade was magnificent and imposing. The colours of each regiment proudly, though scantily, floated in the breeze. They displayed but very little embroidery. Scarcely could the well-earned badges of the regiments be discerned. Yet their lacerated condition, caused by the numberless wounds which they received in battle, gave martial dignity to their appearance and animated every British breast with national pride. The review being terminated, a signal was given for each corps to proceed to that spot of ground which they were destined to open. The whole moved off. All the bands by one accord played the same tune, which was cheered with shouts that bore ominous import and appeared to shake Badajoz to its foundation. The music played was the animating national Irish air, St. Patrick's Day, when the shamrock was proudly clustered with the laurel. And indeed, though these two shrubs are not reckoned of the same family by proud collectors in the cabinet, veterans hold them to be closely allied in the field. Never was St. Patrick's Day more loudly cheered or by stouter hearts, and never was the music more nobly accompanied, nor with more warlike bass. For all the troops echoed the inspiring national air as proudly they marched to their ground. Philippon maintained an incessant fire of cannon, roared forth in proud defiance from the destined fortress, and Badajoz being now invested on both sides of the Guadiana, the operations of the siege were eagerly pressed forward. On the 19th, during the completion of the first parallel, a sortie was made by the besieged soon after midday. 1,500 of their infantry, screened by the Ravelin San Roque, formed between that opening and the Picurina, or small redoubt. They immediately pressed forward and gained the works before our men could seize their arms, while at the same time a party of cavalry, about 50, the only horsemen in the fortress, got in rear of the parallel. The confusion was great at the first onset. Those on guard and the working men were driven out of the trenches, and the cavalry sabred many in the depots at the rear. But the mischief being quickly discovered was soon remedied. The guards being reinforced immediately rallied and drove the enemy out of the works at the point of the bayonet, when many lives were lost. A part of the embankment was thrown into the trenches, and the enemy carried away almost all the entrenching tools found in the parallel. We lost 150 men in killed and wounded during this attack. The siege was now carried on without interruption, notwithstanding the severity of the weather, which frequently filled the trenches with water, and so great was the fall of rain on the 22nd that the pontoon bridge was carried away by the Guadiana, overflowing its banks, and the flying bridges over that river could scarcely be worked. This threatened a failure of the siege, from the difficulty of supplying the troops with provisions and the impossibility of bringing the guns and ammunition across. Fortunately for the attack of the fortress, however, the disaster was remedied by the river falling within its banks. The morning of the 25th was ushered in by saluting the garrison with 28 pieces of cannon opened from 6 different batteries, and in the evening Fort Picurina was stormed gallantly carried and permanently retained. The enemy made a sortie on the night of the 29th, on the right bank of the Guadiana against General Hamilton's division, who invested the fortress on that side. They were driven back with loss, and on this occasion the besiegers had no casualties. On the last day of March 26, pieces of ordnance from the second parallel opened their fire against Fort Trinidad and the flank of the protecting bastion, Santa Maria. This fire continued incessantly, aided by an additional battery of 6 guns, which also opened from the second parallel on the morning of April 4th against the ravelin of San Roque. On the evening of the 6th Trinidad, Santa Maria and the ravelin of San Roque were breached. Preparations were made to storm the town that night, but reports having been made by the engineers that strong works had been erected for the defence of the 2 breaches, particularly in rear of the large one made in the face of the bastion of Trinidad, where deep retrenchments had been constructed and every means resorted to which art and science could devise to prevent an entrance, the attack was therefore put off. Many hundred lives were spared, but for 24 hours only. All the guns in the second parallel were now directed against the curtain of Trinidad, and towards the following evening a 3rd breach appeared, and the storming of Badajoz was arranged in the following order for the night of the 6th. The 4th Division, under command of Major General the Honourable C. Colville, and the Light Division under Lieutenant Colonel Barnard, were destined to attack the 3 breaches opened in the bastion of Trinidad, Santa Maria, and the connecting curtain. Lieutenant General Picton, with the 3rd or Fighting Division, was directed to attack the castle, which, from the great height of its walls and no breach having been attempted there, the enemy considered secure against assault. The ground left vacant by the advance of the 4th and Light Divisions was to be occupied by the 5th Division, commanded by General Leith, with instructions to detach his left brigade, under General Walker, to make a false attack against the works of the fortress near the Guadiana, as also against the detached work, the Pardaleras. Brigadier General Power, commanding a Portuguese brigade on the opposite bank, was ordered to divert by making false attacks upon a newly formed redoubt called Mont Coeur, upon Fort Saint Christoval, upon the Tête du Pont, and upon I forget what else. With these instructions the troops moved forward from the entrenchments about 10 o'clock at night to attack the destined town. The 3rd Division, under Picton, preceded the general movement about a quarter of an hour for the purpose of drawing away the enemy's attention from the openings in the wall, since these were considered the only really vulnerable points of the fortress. The 4th and Light Divisions pushed gallantly forward against these breaches and were not discovered until they had entered the ditch. During their advance, the town was liberally supplied with shells from our batteries, and the upper parts of the breaches were continually fired upon by light troops placed upon the glacis to disperse the enemy and prevent their repairing the broken defences. This fire was but slightly answered, until the 2 divisions mentioned were discovered entering the ditch, when they were assailed by an awful cannonade, accompanied by the sharp and incessant chattering of musketry. Fireballs were shot forth from the fortress, which illumined the surrounding space and discovered every subsequent movement. The dreadful strife now commenced, the thundering cheer of the British soldiers as they rushed forward through the outer ditch, together with the appalling roar of all arms sent forth in defiance from within, was tremendous. Whenever an instant pause occurred, it was filled by the heart-rending shrieks of the trodden-down wounded and by the lengthened groans of the dying. 3 times were the breaches cleared of Frenchmen, driven off at the point of the bayonet by gallant British soldiers to the very summit, when they were by the no less gallant foe each time driven back, leaving their bravest officers and foremost soldiers behind, who, whether killed or wounded, were tossed down headlong to the foot of the breaches. Throughout this dreadful conflict, our bugles were continually sounding the advance. The cry of "Bravo, bravo!" resounded through the ditches and along the foot of the breaches, but no British cry was heard from within the walls of Badajoz, save that of despair, uttered by the bravest who, despite of all obstacles, forced their way into the body of the place, and there through dire necessity abandoned. Groaned forth their last stabbed by unnumbered wounds. Again and again were the breaches attacked with redoubled fury, and defended with equal pertinacity and stern resolution, seconded by every resource which science could adopt or ingenuity suggest. Bags and barrels of gunpowder with short fuses were rolled down, which, bursting at the bottom or along the face of the breaches, destroyed all who advanced. Thousands of live shells, hand grenades, fireballs, and every species of destructive combustible were thrown down the breaches and over the walls into the ditches, which, lighting and exploding at the same instant, rivelled the lightning and thunder of heaven. This at intervals was succeeded by an impenetrable darkness, as of the infernal regions. Gallant foes laughing at death met, fought, bled, and rolled upon earth, and from the very earth destruction burst, for the exploding mines cast up friends and foes together, who in burning torture clashed and shrieked in the air. Partly burned, they fell back into the inundating water, continually lighted by the incessant bursting of shells. Thus, assailed by opposing elements, they made the horrid scene yet more horrid by shrieks uttered in wild despair, vainly struggling against a watery grave, with limbs convulsed and quivering from the consuming fire. The roaring of cannon, the bursting of shells, the rattle of musketry, the awful explosion of mines, and the flaring sickly blaze of fireballs seemed not of human invention, but rather as if all the elements of nature had greedily combined in the general havoc, and heaven, earth, and hell had united for the destruction alike of devoted Badajoz and of its furious assailants. In consequence of untoward disasters, which occurred at the very onset by the troops being falsely led, their numbers were seriously diminished and their compact formation disorganized. The third or last opening in the curtain was never attempted, although this breach was the most practicable, as it had been made only a few hours before, and thus there had been no time to strengthen its defences. Owing to this ruinous mistake, the harassed and depressed troops failed in their repeated attacks. At length, the bugles of the 4th and Light Divisions sounded the recall. At this moment, General Bowes, whom I accompanied in the early part of the fight, being severely wounded, and his aide-de-camp, my old comrade and brother officer Captain Johnson, 28th Regiment, being killed, as I had no duty to perform, my regiment not being present, I attended the general as he was borne to his tent. He inquired anxiously about poor Johnson, his relative, not being aware that this gallant officer received his death shot while he was being carried to the rear, in consequence of a wound which he had received when cheering on a column to one of the breaches. Having seen the general safely lodged, I galloped off to where Lord Wellington had taken his station. This was easily discerned by means of 2 fireballs shot out from the fortress at the commencement of the attack, which continued to burn brilliantly along the water cut which divided the 3rd from the other divisions. Near the end of this channel, behind a rising mound, were Lord Wellington and his personal staff, screened from the enemy's direct fire, but within range of shells. One of his staff sat down by his side, with a candle to enable the general to read and write all his communications and orders relative to the passing events. I stood not far from his lordship, but due respect prevented any of us bystanders from approaching so near as to enable us to ascertain the import of the reports which he was continually receiving. Yet it was very evident that the information which they conveyed was far from flattering, and the recall on the bugles was again and again repeated. But about 11:30 o'clock, an officer rode up at full speed on a horse covered with foam, and announced the joyful tidings that General Picton had made a lodgment within the castle by escalade, and had withdrawn the troops from the trenches to enable him to maintain his dearly purchased hold. Lord Wellington was evidently delighted, but exclaimed, "What? Abandon the trenches? and ordered 2 regiments of the 5th Division instantly to replace those withdrawn. I waited to hear no more, but, admiring the prompt genius which immediately provided for every contingency, I mounted my horse. I was immediately surrounded by a host of Spaniards, thousands of whom, of all ages and sexes, had been collecting at this point for some time from the neighbouring towns and villages to witness the storming and enjoy the brilliant spectacle, wherein thousands of men, women and children, including those of their own country, were to be shot, bayoneted, or blown to atoms. Notwithstanding the hundreds of beautiful females who closely pressed round and even clung to me for information, I merely exclaimed in a loud voice that Badajoz was taken, and then made the best of my way to the walls of the castle. Their height was rather forbidding, and an enfilading fire still continued. The ladders were warm and slippery with blood and brains of many a gallant soldier, who but a few moments previously mounted them with undaunted pride, to be dashed down from their top, and lie broken in death at their foot. As soon as General Picton had arrived at the walls, he instantly ordered them to be escaladed. Frightful as was their height, ladder after ladder failed to be placed against the walls, their determined bearers being killed. But Picton, who never did anything by halves or hesitatingly, instead of parsimoniously sending small parties forward and waiting to hear of their extinction before fresh support was furnished, boldly marched his whole division to the foot of the walls. And thus, without loss of time, by immediately supplying the place of the fallen, he at length succeeded in rearing one ladder. Then, having his reserves close at hand, scarcely was a man shot off when an equally brave successor filled his place, and in this manner those who mounted that one ladder at length made a lodgment. This being firmly established, the fire from within slackened. Many ladders were soon reared, and the whole of the 3rd Division entered the castle. The Connaught Rangers were said to be the first within the wall. In consequence of some misconduct, General Picton had changed the name Rangers to Robbers. After the storming of the castle, a private of the corps called out half-drunken to the general, "Are we the Connaught Robbers now?" "No," answered Picton. "You are the Connaught Heroes." The confusion in the castle was awful all night long. All the gates had been built up but one, and that narrowed to the width of 2 men. On this straight gate, a terrible fire was directed from outside and in. The 3rd Division first fired on the French and, when they had gone, continued to fire on their own comrades of the 5th Division, who had entered the town on the opposite side by escalading the bastion of San Vicente. This capture was opposed as fiercely and made as bravely as that of the castle. The 3rd Division having taken the castle about 11:30, Picton received orders to maintain it until break of day, when he was to sally forth with 2,000 men and fall on the rear of the breaches, which it was intended should again be attacked by the 4th and Light Divisions. The party who carried the ladders of the 5th Division lost their way and did not come up until after 11 o'clock, which necessarily made General Leith an hour late in his attack on the bastion of San Vicente, so that before he entered the town, the castle was in possession of the 3rd Division. The enemy who defended the breaches being no longer attacked in front, turned all their force against the 5th Division as they advanced from their captured bastion along the ramparts. As soon as General Walker's brigade of this division gained the interior of the fortress, they moved forward along the ramparts, driving everything before them until they arrived not far from the breach in the Santa Maria bastion. Here the enemy had a gun placed, and as the British troops advanced, a French gunner lit a port fire. Startled at the sudden and unexpected light, some of the foremost British soldiers cried out, "A mine! A mine!" These words passing to the rear, the whole of the troops fell into disorder, and such was the panic caused by this ridiculous mistake that the brave example and utmost exertions of the officers could not prevail upon the men to advance. The enemy, perceiving the hesitation, pushed boldly forward to the charge, and drove the British back to the bastion of San Vicente, where they had entered. Here a battalion in reserve had been formed, who, in their turn rushing forward to the charge, bayoneted or made prisoner every Frenchman they met, pursuing those who turned as far as the breaches. The 3rd and 5th Divisions interchanged many shots, each ignorant of the other's success and consequent position, and both divisions continued to fire at the breaches, so that had the 4th and Light Divisions made another attack, many must have fallen by the fire of both divisions of their comrades. From both within and without, as has been said, a constant fire was kept up at the narrow and only entrance to the castle. This entrance was defended by a massive door, nearly 2 feet thick, which was riddled throughout, and had the 3rd Division sallied forth during the confusion and darkness, they must have come in contact with the 5th Division, when no doubt many more lives would have been lost before they recognized each other. This was fortunately prevented by Picton being ordered to remain in the castle until morning. The scenes in the castle that night were of a most deplorable and terrific nature. Murders, robberies, and every species of debauchery and obscenity were seen, notwithstanding the exertions of the officers to prevent them. Philippon, expecting that, even though he should lose the town, he would be able to retain the castle at least for some days, had had all the live cattle of the garrison driven in there, the howling of dogs, the crowing of cocks, the penetrating cackle of thousands of geese, the mournful bleating of sheep, the furious bellowing of wounded oxen maddened by being continually goaded and shot at and ferociously charging through the streets, were mixed with accompaniments loudly trumpeted forth by mules and donkeys, and always by the deep and hollow baying of the large Spanish half-wolves, half-bloodhounds, which guarded the whole. Add to this the shrill screaming of affrighted children, the piercing shrieks of frantic women, the groans of the wounded, the savage and discordant yells of drunkards firing at everything and in all directions, and the continued roll of musketry kept up in error on the shattered gateway. And you may imagine an uproar such as one would think could issue only from the regions of Pluto, and this din was maintained throughout the night. Towards morning the firing ceased, and the 4th and Light Divisions passed through the breaches over the broken limbs and dead bodies of their gallant comrades. A great part of the garrison were made prisoners during the night by the 5th Division, but Philippon, with most of the officers and a portion of the men, retreated across the Guadiana into Fort Cristobal. He demanded terms of capitulation next morning, but Lord Wellington gave him 10 minutes to consider and straightway prepared the guns to batter the place. However, that was prevented by Philippon surrendering at discretion. As soon as light served and communication between the castle and the town opened, I bent my way along the ramparts towards the main opening in the Trinidad Bastion. The glorious dawn of day, contrasted with the horrible scenes which I had witnessed, filled the mind with joy. The sun rose in majesty and splendour, as usual in the blooming month of April, which in that climate is as our May. The country around was clothed in luxuriant verdure, refreshed by recent dew, which still clinging to each green leaf and blade in diamond drops reflected the verdant hue of the foliage upon which it hung, till diamonds seemed emeralds. 1,000 nameless flowers, displaying as many lovely colours, were on all the earth. Proudly and silently the Guadiana flowed, exhibiting its white surface to the majestically rising orb, which gave to the ample and gently heaving breast of the noble stream the appearance of an undulating plain of burnished silver. On its fertile banks the forward harvest already promised abundance and contentment even to the most avaricious husbandman. The fruit trees opened their rich and perfumed blossoms. The burnished orange borrowing colour of the sun glowed in contrast with the more delicate gold of lemon, and everywhere grey olive trees spread ample boughs. But here, alas, they were not the emblems of peace. Every creeping bramble and humble shrub made a fair show that morning. Birds sang in heaven. All sensitive and animated nature appeared gay, and seemed with grateful acknowledgments to welcome the glorious Father of light and heat. The Lord of creation alone, sensible and refined man, turned his back on the celestial scene to gloat in the savage murders and degrading obscenity that wantoned in devoted Badajoz. When I arrived at the Great Breach, the inundation presented an awful contrast to the silvery Guadiana. It was fairly stained with gore, which threw the vivid reflection of the brilliant sun, whose glowing heat already drew the watery vapours from its surface, gave it the appearance of a fiery lake of smoking blood, in which were seen the bodies of many a gallant British soldier. The ditches were strewn with killed and wounded, but the approach to the bottom of the main breach was fairly choked with dead. A row of chevaux de frise, armed with sword blades, barred the entrance at the top of the breach, and so firmly fixed that when the 4th and Light Divisions marched through, the greatest exertion was required to make a sufficient opening for their admittance. Boards fastened with ropes to plugs driven into the ground within the ramparts were let down and covered nearly the whole surface of the breach. These boards were so thickly studded with sharp-pointed spikes that one could not introduce a hand between them. They did not stick out at right angles to the board, but were all slanting upwards. In rear of the chevaux de frise, the ramparts had deep cuts in all directions, like a tanyard, so that it required light to enable one to move safely through them, even were there no opposing enemy. From the number of muskets found close behind the breach, all the men who could possibly be brought together in so small a place must have had at least 20 firelocks each, no doubt kept continually loaded by persons in the rear. 2 British soldiers only entered the main breach during the assault. I saw both their bodies. If any others entered, they must have been thrown back over the walls, for certain it is that at dawn of the 7th, no more than 2 British bodies were within the walls near the main breach. In the Santa Maria breach, not one had entered. At the foot of this breach, the same sickening sight appeared as at that of Trinidad. Numberless dead strewed the place. On looking down these breaches, I recognized many old friends, whose society I had enjoyed a few hours before, now lying stiff in death. Oppressed by the sight which the dead and dying presented at the breaches, I turned away and re-entered the town. But oh, what scenes of horror did I witness there! They can never be effaced from my memory. There was no safety for women even in the churches, and any who interfered or offered resistance were sure to get shot. Every house presented a scene of plunder, debauchery, and bloodshed, committed with wanton cruelty on the persons of the defenceless inhabitants by our soldiery, and in many instances I beheld the savages tear the rings from the ears of beautiful women who were their victims, and when the rings could not be immediately removed from their fingers with the hand, they tore them off with their teeth. Firing through the streets and at the windows was incessant, which made it excessively dangerous to move out. When the savages came to a door which had been locked or barricaded, they applied what they called the patent key. This consisted of the muzzles of a dozen firelocks placed close together against that part of the door where the lock was fastened, and the whole fired off together into the house and rooms, regardless of those inside. These salvos were repeated until the doors were shattered, and in this way, too, several inhabitants were killed. Men, women, and children were shot in the streets for no other apparent reason than pastime. Every species of outrage was publicly committed in the houses, churches, and streets, and in a manner so brutal that a faithful recital would be too indecent and too shocking to humanity. Not the slightest shadow of order or discipline was maintained. The officers durst not interfere. The infuriated soldiery resembled rather a pack of hellhounds vomited up from the infernal regions for the extirpation of mankind than what they were but 12 short hours previously, a well-organized, brave, disciplined and obedient British army, and burning only with impatience for what is called glory. But whatever accounts may be given of the horrors which attended and immediately followed the storming of Badajoz, they must fall far short of the truth, and it is impossible for any who were not present to imagine them. I have already mentioned that neither the regiment to which I was just appointed, nor that which I had just left, was at the siege. I therefore could have had but little influence in controlling the frenzied military mob who were ferociously employed in indiscriminate carnage, universal plunder, and devastation of every kind. 3 times I narrowly escaped with life for endeavouring to protect some women by conveying them to St. John's Church, where a guard was mounted. On one occasion, as Huddleston and I accompanied 2 ladies and the brother of one of them to the church mentioned, we were crossed by 3 drunken soldiers, one of whom, passing to our rear, struck the Spanish gentleman with the butt end of his firelock on the back of his head, which nearly knocked him down. On my censuring the fellow's daring insolence in striking a person in company with 2 English officers, another of the men was bringing his firelock to the present, when I hollowed out loudly, "Come on quick with that guard!" There was no guard near, but the ruse luckily succeeded, and so quickly did the soldiers run away that I felt convinced that their apparent intoxication was feigned. On another occasion, a sergeant struck me with his pike for refusing to join in plundering a family. I certainly snapped my pistol in his face, but fortunately it missed fire or he would have been killed. However, the danger, which he so narrowly escaped, brought him to his senses. He made an awkward apology, and I considered it prudent to retire. By such means as these, by the risk and humanity of officers, many women were saved. We did not interfere with the plundering. It would have been useless.